I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for everybody coming in here, and we appreciate you being here. So if I haven't gotten a chance to meet everybody, I'm Charlene Randall. I'm Director of Business Development here at L&E Research, and I wanted to welcome you to today's workshop, Understanding Consumer Psychology for Better Insights. So we'd like to thank all of you who are here in person, as well as all of those who are attending with us remotely this morning through L&E Research's video streaming. In fact, we're really excited that we had such a good amount of interest and response to this particular workshop. So we actually have record numbers of people that are viewing with us this morning online. So thank you so much to all of you who are out there joining us today. Each quarter, L&E Research does sponsor educational workshops such as this, and we just pick a variety of topics. We bring in the experts, and we offer them complimentary to our friends and clients. Today, we're hosting our workshop here at our Cincinnati, Ohio facility, but in addition to this focus group facility, L&E Research does have facilities in Columbus, Ohio, so here close by. We're in Baltimore, Maryland. We're in Charlotte, North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, where we're headquartered and where I'm from. We're also in Tampa, Florida, and we have 2 focus group facilities in St. Louis. We are proudly celebrating 30 years this year of excellent customer service and supporting researchers and companies with their marketing research, recruiting, and facility needs. Today's workshop will be recorded. So within a couple weeks, we're going to have a link to the recording up on our website. So if you wanted to go back and just get a refresher, or if you wanted to share it with your colleagues, it will be available to you. And while you're there on the website, you can check out some of our other workshops that we've done as well. So today's speaker is Jason Rogers of Nodus Information Technology. And Nodus Information Technology develops and delivers innovative software and hardware solutions and services for the measurement and analysis of behavior. So they allow their customers to advance their research, product development, training, and education. Nodus has 14 offices in 8 different countries and is represented by 12 distributors worldwide. While their international headquarters are located in the Netherlands, they also have offices throughout Europe. They're in China, in the United States, and in Canada. But I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about Jason, our speaker for today. And so Jason received his doctorate in experimental psychology with an emphasis on cognitive and neurosystems. So focused on how different brain systems interact when learning and remembering new environments. After a few years in research, Jason joined Nodus in 2008 as behavior expert, product specialist, and lead trainer while he lectured and trained researchers across countries and continents. So what do you do in your spare time, Jason? So yeah, exactly. So Jason also spent some time doing neuromarketing research with Nielsen Neurofocus and qualitative marketing research with Brand Trust. Later, he rejoined Nodus in 2013 as Midwestern account manager while simultaneously building consultative services for Nodus in North America. Today, Jason holds the position of product expert and lead trainer. But also joining Jason today is one of his colleagues, Abby Macbeth, and so I'd love to just point Abby out here. Abby is a scientist and account manager for Nodus, and she has 15 years of experience in overseeing scientific projects from inception to write-up. She has over 10 years of experience in behavioral neuroscience, specializing in maternal and pre-postpartum behaviors, managing experiments, gathering and analyzing scientific data, scientific writing and presenting, as well as teaching in the classroom and laboratory. Another overachiever. So Abby is also author and co-author of a dozen publications in peer-reviewed journals, including Progress in Neurobiology's most cited article and numerous abstracts. So without further delay, I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Jason. And Jason Rogers, thank you so much for being here. So, and I'm going to be careful not to trip on that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, of course. Thank you all for coming. I do appreciate it, and I would like to thank L&E, especially Charlene, Michelle, who is joining us remotely, who was instrumental for putting this all together, and Heidi and Elizabeth, and those of you at L&E for making this happen, and of course Abby for being here to help listen to this a number of times and brainstorm some of the ideas. The whole idea of what we're talking about really is this metaphor of finding the forest for the trees. And this all came about because we all get really focused on what we're doing in our day-to-day activities that sometimes it's difficult to step back and see what other people might be doing, or what else is going on in the research field, or what new things are emerging in the technology, that we get so focused on our individual trees, metaphorically, that we don't get a chance to really step back and look at our quote-unquote forest, which is really our consumer, right? That's what we're really looking at. And our whole goal is really to develop and design the best services and research for our consumers, right? That's what we're after, be it our clients to get to our consumers or our consumers directly, right? And as we go through this, obviously those of you who are remote, if you have questions, you can email them and we'll follow up with you afterwards. So please feel free to write them down and send them to us. And for those of you who are here, we'll stop through the various sections. So if you have questions, write them down, feel free. And you don't have to save them to the end. We'll try to address them as they're fresh in your head. And please, I encourage you to ask questions. All right. So as an introduction, I want to go over the traditional way that we look at the buying process, some updated things that Nielsen has, the traditional way we view consumer psychology, and then a little bit about the brain. And I say a little bit because this is really my area of expertise, but we're not going to get into the details of the brain, don't worry. And then we're going to look at the consumer psychology centered around that, focusing mainly on the different feelings, emotional aspects of it. How do we measure emotion? How do we leverage emotion? Same thing for thinking, for logic, for reason. This is traditional market research as we know it. And then for my other favorite part, the doing, the behavior part, right? Of people actually doing something. And then how do we put all these together, right? To see the forest for all of this. Okay? Right, so we're going to start with the traditional buying process. And this comes from 1910 from John Dewey. And it's a pretty good start for 100 years old. But the basic steps are we start with a problem or a need recognition. And then we do some information search. And then we evaluate our alternatives, make a purchase decision, right? Okay, and you see it's all very logical. It's all very step-by-step. It's all very heavily dominated, which you don't see heavily dominated by British empiricism as a philosophical thing in the early part of the 20th century. And if you want to make an impulse decision, maybe you go from need recognition right to purchase decision, right? So if you want that chocolate bar right there on the shelf, maybe you don't search for alternatives, and maybe you just go right for it, right? But it's still very step-by-step by logical organization. And some new ways that we look at this now, this is taken from Nielsen. This is their path to purchase, right? Where we start with some demand and that leads to buying. And it's a little bit more dynamic than a simple step-by-step 1 through 5. At least now we've got a little bit more circular dynamic to it, right? But it still has plan and place and purchase and the consumption and the evaluation and the engagement. And it's still very boxy. Right? Even though it is more dynamic, it's still very boxy. And for those of you who have psychology backgrounds like me, you identify with this very much, that in psychology, we love boxes. We love 2D images. We love arrows. We love to categorize everything, right? And we love to take something complex like consumers and box it as much as we possibly can in a 2D image like you see here. So factors influencing consumer behavior, the psychological that we're going to kind of go over today, some social, personal, cultural, etc., right? And again, for those of you who have ever sat through any psychology course, we love to do this. It doesn't matter what topic it is. We do this with the brain. We do this with personality. We do this with every aspect of psychology. But the reality of consumer psychology of these 2D images The reality is that it's actually happening here, right? It's happening on the couch watching television. It's happening in the store. It's happening right now as you're sitting. It's happening right now as you're listening live. It's happening as you're driving down the street. It's happening all the time. It's not a discrete thing that's here. It's a dynamic process that's always occurring. And these discrete factors of the social aspects and the psychological, they're all interplaying, right? It's a big mess in the reality. The boxes are not as clean as we like to make them. Complicating matters even further is all of those things are occurring there, but they're also occurring here inside of our brains, right? This is actually a picture of my brain. Sure.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, this was pre-grad school, so it still functions. It still functions. It's my pre-grad school brain. But the whole point, like I said, is that all of these things are occurring in our brain. And you've got this big hunk of fat up in your head that is really influencing all of these things, right? And it's not all brain-centric, right? We have other factors, but for the most part, it's what we're talking about. And from a theoretical perspective, right, talking about this concept of forest for the trees and this dynamic process, what we're talking about is really heavily biased, in my opinion, from where I come from, by Gestalt psychology theory. And this is an old theory in psychology. We all know the word Gestalt in our sort of cultural mindset. We all have this word of what Gestalt is. But there was a really famous German researcher by the name of Kurt Kafka who gave us this quote. Actually, it's really mistranslated. The quote is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? You all heard this before? That's not actually what he said. He actually said that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. The translation put greater on top of different. The whole idea, though, is you see a bunch of blobs, right? Can anybody see anything other than a bunch of blobs? Yes. Yes. In fact, what it really is from the blobs emerges a Dalmatian. And in psychology, we call this an emergent property, right? The whole concept of an emergency comes out of this word of emergent, right? That many things have gone wrong and now they need your attention right now. Things have gone bad, needs attention now. Something has emerged that demands your attention. And in psychology, we talk about these factors coming together, this random blobness, that out of it springs an emergent property like the Dalmatian. So again, this is kind of what we're talking about, right? Taking the individual blobs of consumer psychology, the emotional aspects, the cognitive aspects, the behavioral aspects, because that's really the time we have today. We could go on and on and on and on. You could do a whole college course and seminar on all of this. But the goal is to take all these individual blobs and put them all together, right? And why is that? Well, for those of you who are going to the market research event this year in Orlando, one of the keynote speakers whose name, if he's listening or if anybody knows him, I apologize for slaughtering his name. I think it's O'Reilly. Am I saying that? Dan O'Reilly, who say that humans are predictively irrational. Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm really bad at phonetics, so I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. But by being predictively irrational, we can look at some of the emotional aspects of it, right? We can look at those emotional boxes. We can look at some of the thought or logic or reason boxes. We can look at some of the actions to kind of put them together. Why? Well, we can develop a deeper understanding of our consumers, and possibly, because all of us are consumers, maybe even ourselves, maybe the way we think about things, right? How do we develop a better survey? The last L&E presentation was all about designing a better survey, and hopefully you guys got a chance to see that. And how do you design better surveys, right? And then, of course, this is the goals. You have all seen this before when you signed up for the workshop. The goals, so look at the big picture, maybe reframe things, maybe take some things into account, right? So this is all, again, very, very theoretical, but maybe we learned something out of this. Excuse me. Okay. Another metaphor, or another thing I want you to think of, it's like this, right? So we've got circles and we've got arrows and we've got boxes. This is called Metatron's cube. That doesn't matter. Think about it like this, right? So each circle is a different aspect of consumer psychology. And we look at this in 2D and you say, wow, there's some circles, there's some squares, there's a lot of lines. It's really confusing. But again, if we look at it from a different perspective, we see that it is actually a 3D cube interconnected at all points. So we take that 2D image and out of it emerges this 3D view, right? Okay. So if we're getting started, I first want to start by looking at some brains. Right? And what better way than, I don't actually watch The Walking Dead. I'm more of a Night of the Living Dead, but that's because of my age. But I want to start with some neuroscience. And don't worry, this is not going to be too complicated. High level, high level, high level. So I want you guys to take your fists and put them together. That is about the size of your brain, right? So if you put that in your head and pull out, this is about the size of your brain. Really? Not that big. It's probably, don't quote me on this, but about 90% fat. So, in fact, the fact that why zombies like to eat it, I don't know. It's not right. A tasty treat. Right?
It's like a cheeseburger.
Yes. So here what you see are three views. In the left-hand side, you see the underside of it. So if you were looking at from underneath here, the underside of the brain. If you were to cut it in half, right? If we were to cut it in half and then look at the side, we see here, we call this a sagittal view, doesn't matter. And then if we pull it out and look at this side, that's here. And then if we look at the other side, we see here. So in the bottom, what you're actually looking at is this side. And I want to call to your attention really the front part of your brain, because that's kind of what more or less we're talking about today. There's another little part, but we're really talking about the frontal cortex of your brain for two reasons. One is where all of your motor association, motor being your movements, right? So as a pitcher is standing on the mound, right? I know the Reds are in spring training and getting ready to start in a few weeks. So as Cueto's standing on the mound, anticipating what pitch he's going to throw, all of those neurons in his motor cortex are getting the rest of his body set up to throw that perfect pitch, right? And he does it far better than I could ever hope to, but it's really that motor association cortex. In addition, if you look up all the way into the front, and really if you go right behind the eyes, that's where a lot of our executive function, that's where a lot of our decisions are being made, right? So those of you who play chess or checkers or even really fun games like Othello and Go, this is where all those moves are being anticipated. In addition, right next to it, right behind the eyes, it's called orbital frontal, which means it's the part of your eyes, right, part of your frontal brain right behind the eyes, is where we make decisions about what is appropriate, right? It's not appropriate if you were to stand up right now and start screaming wildly, right? That would be deemed socially inappropriate, right? It would also be inappropriate for you to jump in your car and drive to the casino downtown and spend all of your money, right? Also deemed socially inappropriate. But people who have compulsive gambling addiction, they have problems with that area, right? Schizophrenics, problem with that area, right? So not only is your frontal part of your brain getting all of your movements coordinated, but it's also making decisions that make us uniquely human. Rats have this part of the brain, dogs have this part of the brain, dolphins have this part of the brain, but it's not as developed as it is. Maybe a dolphins, but a dogs and a rat's not nearly as developed as a human's. Now, one other thing, actually two more things that I want to talk about here is, I can't show you because it's deep and tucked away, but there's a part of your brain in the underside. Let me get the mouse over there. Where's my mouse? Come over. Right about in here, on the underside of your brain and the temporal lobe, is an area of your brain that's specifically designed for looking at faces. And in fact, it is called the fusiform face gyrus. Our brains are hardwired to see faces. And if any of you have ever read Oliver Sacks or know the great psychologist Oliver Sacks, he has a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He had a function, a disease in that area. It's called prosopagnosia. It doesn't matter what it's called. You can't recognize someone's face. He would see himself in the mirror and say, "Hi, how you doing?" He didn't even recognize his own self. And so he was not able to put all of that together. And the reason is because we'll get there when we talk more about faces, but the face, there are so many features of the face put together that they are so distinctly human. It's also an expertise area, so people who are really into birding also show emphasis there and things, but it's mainly for faces. Okay, now, one thing I want you to do as an exercise, put your hand together, like imagine if you were like doing a little thing like this, right? So imagine this is your frontal part of your brain, this is your parietal, this is your occipital, here's your temporal, and this is your spinal cord, right? Just like you see over here, just a very crude. I want you to take your thumb and I want you to open it up and peel open the inside of the temporal lobe, and we see something along this line, right? So on the inside of all of that, if we could pull off the cortex and peel open the inside of your brain, you have these structures, and I want to call to your attention the one in red, specifically this almond-shaped structure known as the amygdala. Anatomists are not very clever at naming things. Almond in Greek is the amygdala. So it looked like an almond, so they named it the fancy Greek word for almond. Oh, goodness. Same reason that this structure directly next to it, called the hippocampus, is Greek for seahorse, because that's what it looked like. Why I call this to your attention is this is where all of your emotions are centered, or most of your emotions, right? When a child is right between the ages of, say, 18 months to 3 years old, this structure is really coming online. One of our former colleagues, one of our friends, said that her daughter is rapidly cycling some bipolar disorder. They call it the terrible twos. This is when your amygdala is coming online, and it doesn't have that frontal part of your brain to say, hey, that's not appropriate. It's just your amygdala is unchecked, and that's why children act as crazy as they do. It is also the part of the brain that is responsible for conditioning. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, is that symmetric, or is it just on the right?
No, it's on both sides.
Yeah,
You have
okay.
both sides.
Okay.
So the amygdala also is responsible for conditioning. Conditioning, what I mean, is Pavlov. We've all heard of Pavlov's dog, ring the bell, and you salivate, right? When I was in college, my learning professor had us take some Tang. I don't even know if they make Tang anymore, but it's a very sour, powdery drink. And he would say, Pavlov, and we would put it on our tongue. And even now I'm salivating. 18 years later, I'm still salivating thinking about it. He would go, Pavlov, and you'd put the thing on your tongue and you'd start salivating. It's creating associations, right? Just like I said with Pavlov's dog, you ring the bell and the dog starts salivating because he knows the meat's coming, right? Your amygdala is also responsible for that. There's a really great example as a teaser for how BMW really uses this, for example. Now, why do I bring this up? Because the amygdala is directly connected to those prefrontal cortex part of your brain, right? So again, ignore the back half, as everyone else in research does, and just focus on that front. And what we're talking about is the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, because that is the foundation for our emotion, our thinking, and our actions. They're all highly interconnected in our brains. Right? Just as they are highly interconnected in the way that consumer psychology works, where they exist in our brains are also highly connected. And that's all I want to really touch upon. And we can talk more neuroanatomy until the cows come home. We can do that later. Okay. Questions so far? Fabulous. Either I'm not doing a good enough job or I'm confusing you all. Okay. So now looking at taking this into the actual parts, the trees themselves, I want to first start with some duality, right? And in addition to boxes, psychology loves duality, as do humans and religion, but that's another time. We've all seen this picture, and in fact, everyone who showed this at either a market research event or Quirks, every one of you who show it all say, we all hate this slide, right? We all hate this picture. Well, I kind of love it because we hate it. This is the usual iceberg, right? And this started even with Freud by saying what is available to our conscious minds is really the iceberg above the water, and what is all in our unconscious or subconscious is what is below the water. So we call this unconscious versus consciousness, right? So consciousness is of the fact that I'm aware that I'm standing in front of you. the fact that I'm being recorded, or the fact that I'm talking, or etc. What is unconscious is what my endocrine system is doing, or what my stress hormones are doing, or the fact that I'm pacing back and forth without even realize that I'm doing it until now I'm aware I'm doing it. Now I'm going to stop, right? That's all unconscious. We also call this declarative versus non-declarative because things that are conscious can be verbalized or declared or stated versus things that are unconscious you cannot describe. And this is going to be really important when we actually look at some of the emotional aspects. You can't understand, you can't explain why you feel the way you do. And in fact, any attempt to is failing. The behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman calls this System 1 versus System 2. Same thing. System 1 is the fast, unconscious, emotional. System 2 is the slow, deliberate, conscious, right? And so we're going to come back to these as duality, come back to why they matter and how they play back and forth, right? But it's something to keep in mind again. Now, I can't see anyone raising their hand who are remote, but how many of you here have heard the nonsense statement that we only use 10% of our brains, right? How many of you saw that movie, Lucy? Right, oh, wow, more than you, I thought. Okay. Here's the reality. You use 100% of your brain 100% of the time, 24/7 until the day you die. Your brain is always working. Even when you're asleep, your brain is working. If you only use 10% of your brain would stop using it. Your brain is all based on neuroeconomics. What is the most efficient way to do it? We create habits to try to optimize our performance because our brain doesn't want to use its resources. You're using all of your brain all the time. It goes back to what Freud said, only about 10% is available to our conscious minds. The unconscious part is your brain and your spinal cord telling your heart to beat, your lungs to breathe, to keep you upright while you're sitting in that chair, right? What did you have for dinner last night? You weren't thinking about it until I brought it up, but now you can remember it. What's the capital of France? You weren't thinking about it, but now you know, right? It's all there. It's all available. It's just what's being used, right? So as neuroscientists, especially thanks to that blasted movie, Lucy, all the brain, all the time, correct someone if they tell you differently. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox and get back to the story. So I want to start first with emotions, right? Why do we look at emotions? Why are emotions important? I love this picture. This is my dog. This is my dog, Yugen. He is probably the most emotional creature I've ever seen. In a theory of reincarnation, he and I are the same, just in different lifetimes. Right, remember I said emotions tie back to the amygdala, but why do we study them? What is it about emotions that are worth studying? Well, the one thing is that they are universally expressed. And that's why I show the picture of the dog, a rat, a cat, a mouse, a child, all of us, all experience something that we call emotion. Right? We all have some sort of physiological experience that we deem emotions. What else is really interesting about them is they are unconscious. They're System 1. They're non-declarative. But they're really powerful. So let me give you a story. Excuse me. One of the most famous patients in neuropsychology, his initials were HM. He died 7-8 years ago. He had epilepsy, and so they removed part of his brain to control his epilepsy. It worked, but he had no ability to make new memories. Right? If you've ever seen the movie Memento from Christopher Nolan, same kind of thing. He couldn't make new memories. He was stuck in his 30s. And so, naturally, the neuroscientists and the psychologists said, hey, let's study this guy. And they noticed that every time HM would introduce himself, every day, for a month, they went to visit him, and every day he had no memory of meeting them. Every day. So one of the grad students or one of the professors decided to get one of those toy buzzers. Every time he shook his hand, he would zap him. And after a few days, I can't remember exactly how long, but after a few days, He walked into the room, "Hi, Henry, how are you?" And HM would say, I don't want to shake your hand. Right? Remember the conditioning from the amygdala. And he would say, well, why not? Have we met before? I've never met you before in my life. I don't want to shake your hand. Right? He was able to make that emotional connection that he's going to get shocked if he shakes his hand, even though he has no memory of doing it. But then he would justify, oh, well, I just went to the toilet and I didn't wash my hands, or, I got something on my hands, and so I don't, I'm kind of sick. He would justify his behavior because he wasn't aware of why. He couldn't figure out why he didn't want to do this behavior. Right? So again, emotions are universally expressed, they're powerful, and they have some really strong impacts. Okay, so how do we typically study them in the way we go about things? Well, the first thing you can do is you can put some electrodes on somebody's head, and you can do an EEG, right? And this is a little extreme, but this is prove the point, right? You can put an EEG on someone's head, and you can do consumer neuroscience, or what we all know as neuromarketing, right? And it's going to measure brain waves on the surface of the brain and be able to pick out those waves. And if you know your advanced algorithms, you can pull out some meaning of that. It's inherently difficult because you're all market researchers, but I doubt any of you are neuroscientists. No offense if you are. But even if you are, Abby and I are both neuroscientists, and I can't tell you the first thing about an EEG wave. They're really complicated. And in addition to that, remember that amygdala, that little almond, is really deep and buried inside of your brain. Some people even call it part of the the reptilian brain, right? It's that old as a structure. So getting to it and understanding it can be very difficult. It's not to say it's not possible, but it can be very difficult. In addition to that, you can't determine the positive from the negative. You can just say you're having an emotional reaction. You can't look at whether that's positive or negative. But so you can do it. You can put some electrodes on. You could look at attention, or in Malcolm McDowell's case, force his eyes open and do some conditioning, for those of you who've seen A Clockwork Orange. Another way you can get at emotion is through storytelling. So you have someone either tell a narrative, or you have them walk through a story. This is the kind of work that I was doing in Chicago, where you would have them tell a story related to a brand or an experience, and then you would look for some of the emotional valence that they would use. Right? At the conferences, you'll see the vendors. There are a ton of text analytic companies blowing up, all centered around this kind of thing. How do we take the story? How do we take the narrative and pull out those analytics? And how do we analyze the emotional words from the cognitive words? And how do we process all of that, right? Another way we can do it, and we'll talk more about this in addition to the emotion with also some of the cognitive processes, is through implicit association. This is another one that's really sort of blowing up. And implicit association is a reaction time task. So you have two buttons, and you press a button when you need to make the associate. Right? I take it you guys have some knowledge of implicit association. Right. It came out of Tony Greenwald's lab at the University of Washington, a brilliant researcher who's still there. And we'll talk more about it when we get to some of the other areas. But again, instead of measuring scalp electrodes, or instead of measuring what people are saying, this is looking at how you react, and how the emotional bias you have either makes you faster or slower, depending on how you categorize things. So the final way we can look at it, without putting anything on someone's head, without asking them to say anything, without asking them to do anything, is we can just simply look at their face. Right? This is a picture from the pioneering researcher Paul Ekman. This is actually Paul Ekman, where he spent a lot of time in front of the mirror describing all the different aspects of the face. So I want to tell you a little bit more about faces, right? Because they are, metaphorically, the window into the amygdala, right? And how many of you have seen the show Lie to Me? That Lie to Me is based on Paul Ekman. He is the human lie detector. Brilliant, brilliant guy. So Charles Darwin first proposed that emotions are universally expressed, but Darwin said that emotions were culturally specific. And in the 1950s, that really dominated the philosophy, that as Americans, we have a different set of learned cultural expressions and emotions than someone, say, in Japan or in Papua New Guinea. Well, Paul Ekman set out to challenge that. And he traveled all around the world, and he found that there are 7 basic emotions, which you can see Tim Roth demonstrating here. There's fear, right? And we all know the look of fear. Eyes wide open, upper lip raised, etc. There's anger. We all know what anger looks like. Disgust. If you would like, afterwards I can show you a funny video that we did for a cheese company of a woman eating a piece of cheese. The look of disgust. Sadness. We all know, again, what sadness, surprise, happy, and contempt. Now, of all of those, happy is the only positive emotion, which is really interesting and speaks to sort of culturally, are we hardwired to be unhappy? That's not for this particular talk, but perhaps. There have been some more expanded ones, but these are the basic ones, right? And again, remember, I told you, your brain is hardwired to recognize these. Your brain is hardwired to recognize my face, or perhaps Charlene's face, or Abby's face, or any of you out there. You're hardwired to recognize faces, but then also to read those emotions. Paul Ekman created, it's called the Facial Action Coding System, FACS coding. It takes about 1,000 hours to become trained, fully trained, on how to recognize facial emotion. You spend a lot of time in front of the mirror, like a Norman Rockwell painting, looking at yourself, making emotions, looking at all the detail points of your face. Now, as you no doubt have seen in some of conferences or webinars, etc., there's a new automated way, right? There are a number of companies, Noldus is one of them, Affectiva is another, iMoten, where we have automated facial recognition, emotional facial recognition. And if Pete's watching in the office, hi Pete, this was the surprise I didn't tell you about. This is Pete from the office. This is Pete watching a video of dogs and cats, and in this particular video, the cat was licking himself in areas that you shouldn't, and Pete's emoting appropriately. But here we see that, again, since emotions or facial emotions are universally expressed, we can categorize them by looking at the points of the face, looking at these things that Paul Ekman called action units. The brow is lowered, the upper lip is open, and all of these have numbers assigned to them. And then the combination of those are not only the basic emotions, but some of the other higher order emotions as well. Originally, I had a slide in here, but in the sake of time, I took it out, showing a comparison of Paul Ekman making these faces, and then chimpanzees and gorillas making those exact same faces. Right? All universally expressed. And again, the advantage of this is all you need is a camera. You're not asking anyone to do anything. You're asking them just to act naturally. Try this and look at their face. Tell me a story and look at their face. Right? So you can combine methodology, but this is just purely facial expression, right? So once we, either some neuromarketing, storytelling, once we get some emotional stuff, what do we do with it, right? What's so important about emotions, and what do we do with them? Well, for those of you from the GAP team who are listening, I'm sorry for bringing this sore subject up, but so for example, a few years ago, GAP changed their logo, and bad, right? It was outcry, people were going crazy. One of the early studies that NeuroFocus did was to look at people's brains and found that the new GAP logo on the right didn't really jive with people's brains. They didn't really like it. The brain didn't like it, much less people. And so then GAP had to go back and change it, right? So the logos that we have, or the logos that are our branding messaging, carry such emotion. Same thing with CSs. This is our psychology word for conditioned stimulus. Like with patient HM and the buzzer, BMW actually has engineers hired to specially formulate a creak in the door So when you open the door, they all creak the same way. So you get that little buzzer, if you will, every time you get out and every time you get back into your BMW. In addition to the smells that they all have, right? BMWs all smell the same. So even cars, this is a big thing for them. Like as you get out, you get that reinforcement. Or as you get back in, you get that reinforcement. Same thing with jingles. How many of you can say the State Farm jingle, right? Or say the Nationwide logo, right? Say it. I dare you. Don't sing it, right? Using jingles to kind of help reinforce that emotional aspect of it, right? And then, of course, in our messaging, right? How do you take something boring, well, in my opinion, boring, like trading stocks? Well, what do? You put a baby doing it, right? Who doesn't love a cute little baby who acts like a human, who's trading his stocks? We love babies. You put a baby, you put faces, you put dogs up, right? The Subaru commercials that you see, they have dog-friendly. The dogs are doing human-be things. These are nonsense, right? We know babies don't use smartphones. We know dogs can't drive. But it doesn't matter. It still induces an emotional reaction for us. It doesn't have to be logical because we're talking about something that's system one, something unconscious, something that we can't verbally describe, right? Abby brought up to me something that Nationwide did in the Super Bowl commercial, right? How many of you saw the Nationwide Super Bowl commercial with the little boy saying, I could have done all these things, but I died, and I didn't get a chance to do it, right? Talk about Captain Buzzkill during the Super Bowl. Just show Peyton Manning, do the jingle, and be done with it. Right? So, I mean, even the messaging, during the Super Bowl, do you really want to have your message be associated with death? Well, I could have had nationwide insurance, but I died, right? That's how it comes across, right? So we need to think about the way our messaging and the way we go about doing some things, right? And again, we could go on and on and on about this, but in the sake of time, does anyone have any questions so far? All right, good. Again, either I'm not doing my job appropriately or it's just not detailed enough. So moving from emotion, now we're moving into the world of thought and thinking, right? This is partly homage to Captain Spock. But
I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am, please.
It took me a minute.
Please.
I'm not quite there. On the conditioned stimulus,
Yes.
so since you guys like boxes and lists, like the emotions, like there's those basic emotions, are there, is there that list or are there a list of conditioning stimuli that tend to be universal? You know what I'm saying? Like the touch or is there anything around that?
That's an excellent question. So the conditioned stimulus itself is random and has no value.
Or
The reaction is what we're looking for. So we call this the unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's case, how we all came about it, is the dog wants to eat. The dog sees the meat and begins to salivate. He can't control that. Anything that's going to induce a positive reaction can be used as an unconditioned stimulus. Food, people, sex, anything that's really emotive can be used that way, right?
Okay.
Touch also, right? So every time, try it with your friends. Every time you go to touch one of your friends, like play a sound and touch them on the arm, right? And see what happens after a little bit. See if they even notice, right? But anything along that line can be used as an unconditioned stimulus when paired with something random.
Okay.
Right?
It's the pairing.
It's the pairing that creates that. Right, absolutely. Now, this is what we talk about when we do traditional market research, right? And this is surveys. This is what we're asking what people think. This is the traditional stuff. And I want to return to the traditional buying process. But first, I want to say, what is the famous thing from Descartes, right? I'm not a big Descartes fan because of duality, but what is it that Descartes said? I think, therefore I exist, right? The Latin word that he used for thinking, cogito, right? That translates to the English word cognition. And the way we think of cognition is thinking. So let's return to the buying process and see if we highlight some of the words. This traditional buying process. First, we recognize that we have a need, right? This is a cognitive process. We think about the fact that we have a need. Then we look for data, for information. And then we evaluate that data based on that recognition. And then we make a decision based on that evaluation. This is all very logical. Right? This is all System 2 logical, declarative stuff. Right? So thinking about thinking. Abby calls me this all the time. This is all very meta, right? So we're going to think about the concept of thinking. Traditionally, when we think about this gets heavily into the concept of consciousness. And as you can see, this is from one of my favorite bands. It's a Swedish band by the name of Zone. This is from their album. We all have this sort of window in our head, this person inside of our head, right? This Tyler Durden from Fight Club interacting, right? We call this in our internal monologue. We call this the voice inside our head. We call this whatever, where we talk to ourselves. We all have this concept of viewing the outside world separate from us internally, right? But why do we care what people think? Well, it's simple. We can ask. I can ask all of you what you think, right? 2 plus 2, what's the answer? It's 4. I can ask you that, right? It's measurable. It's System 2. It's declarative. It's conscious. If I offered you this half-drunk cup of water for $1,000 or this somewhat drunk Walmart bubble water for $2 and you really want water, which one are you going to go for, right? $1,000 or $2? Well, it's an easy decision. There's no emotion involved. It's purely number-based. It's very logical. Give me the $2, right? Unless you don't want to drink after me because you're afraid of germs or something. But the other thing that's about it is it's relatively inexpensive, right? You don't need some fancy neuromarketing equipment. You don't need any fancy software for recognizing the face. I could write a survey on that notepad, hand it all out to you, and collect some data and be done with it. So it's easy, it's fast, it's cheap, we can ask people. But it begs the question, right? Can we really know what others are thinking? Well, what we're really talking about here is data. Empirical data. Numbers. Right? And it can be qualitative. I don't want to say it's all quant. It can be qualitative, right? But what we're talking about is measuring something that we can measure. Right? And in fact, in the history of psychology, we actually abandoned, I say we, but I wasn't alive, but we abandoned the concept of consciousness because we couldn't measure it. It's just this theoretical thing. We got to get rid of that. We got to talk about things we can measure. It was heavily driven by a philosophy called British empiricism, where empirical knowledge, things we can directly observe and directly measure. That's what we want to look at, right? And the traditional way we do this are surveys, focus groups, like this beautiful facility we have here. There's some other fun things that we'll talk about, like one of my favorite, discrete choice modeling. Right, so surveys, right? We all know survey. Everybody knows survey data. Everybody gets 1,000 surveys a day via email. You can do it a number of different ways, right? So, for example, here's an ad. How many of you remember this Super Bowl ad? How many remember what this was for? Do you remember what brand this was for?
Doritos.
Was it Doritos? I don't even remember. I thought it was GoDaddy, but all right. I honestly don't. Okay, all right. So, yeah, right. So, but as Abby pointed out, this is a closed question, right? Do you remember this? No. Oh, okay, next question, right? There's no opportunity to learn anything more. It's a closed question. If they say no, you're done. You don't get to the tell me more. Right? So another way that we typically do this, and this is just a sample survey actually that I received earlier this week based on my trip to the University of Wisconsin last week. This is from but whatever, hotel surveys are all the same. We use what we call a Likert scale, where we categorically separate something on a 5 or 7 point scale. How satisfied were you? How likely are you to recommend it? How was your room? Or how were the service? And things like that, right? We all know Likert scales, and we all know these things. We then convert these to numbers, right? So then we can say, based on this, we can make predictions about where we are. Right? This also serves a quality assurance, a QA purpose, right? So if you fill out very dissatisfied, then the branch manager can contact you to say, hey, what happened? Tell me about it. And right. So it serves not only a purpose for research, but also to make sure that your guests are happy, to ensure repeat business. Right? And then at the end, they'll ask some other questions that we'll get to when we get to this concept of segmentation, right? Some demographic, right? Was this personal or business? And then some questions I didn't put that I did cut off at the bottom. Who am I? What gender am I? How much money do I make? And all that stuff. Right? I don't need to tell you guys about surveys. You guys probably know more about surveys than I do. And again, if you want to watch last year's or last time L&E did a research, there was a really great presentation on how do you write better surveys, right? So you can go online and watch that. It's pretty cool. Now, two other ways that we've done in the past, conjoint analysis was pretty fashionable. It's fell out of favor as of late. I wish it would come back because it's one of my favorite. A conjoint actually won Daniel McFadden the Nobel Prize in Economics back in the 1970s. And what you do is you give people a series of choices. And then based on those attributes, you can then do some algorithms to look at the numbers and then say, if you change the attribute by X amount, people are Y% likely to do something, right? So for example, here, you can do this with TVs, you can do this with cell phone providers, we could even do it with traffic and things like that. So you have a plasma, an LCD, or a LED, you have a size, you have a brand, and you have a price. So given all of those, which one would you choose? And then maybe the next one, they'll change them all around, and then you make your choices, and after a series of choices, you can run some algorithms to pull out from those attributes what are the optimal ones. And if you change them, so if we offer the Sony at $699, we can say, oh, you're 36% more likely to get people to buy, right? So this is called discrete choice modeling, is this other word. Conjoint analysis is this more fancy title. Again, it was really favorable, say 10, 15 years ago. It seemed like everybody was doing it. Not so much now. You can automate this in a really cool way. Another way is this implicit association, and really this cartoon really describes the implicit association perfectly. So in the cartoon, for those of you who can't see it, there's a boy and a girl walking, and he says, really, you don't look like an Indian? And in his thought bubble, you see the Redskins, you see Pocahontas, you see Chief Wahoo, you see an Apache, right? You see all this mental baggage that the person has. Really? This is my conception of an Indian. You don't fit that conception, right? And you can tap into that emotionally or logically to look at how people are reacting. And if it fits, I better stop doing that. But if you look at, if it fits, then you're faster at making that association. So if you're a Coke loyalist and you think Coke is good, when you see that on the screen, you're going to say, yes, Coke is good. And when you see it Pepsi good, you're going to be slower to hit that yes. So you're looking at reaction times. Again, this came out of Tony Greenwald's lab at the University of Washington, who started this with implicit bias. So one of my favorite studies, because it drives people like Abby crazy, is they looked at men and women in the hard sciences versus the social sciences. So biology, chemistry, the really hard sciences, versus art and history and psychology. And then had people, if you had to choose and categorize, people have an implicit bias that men belong in the hard sciences and women belong in the social sciences, right? And so you can pull out those kinds of things. You can do this with branding, and some of the things that we did in Chicago was looking at how this fit with the messaging of the brand. Was this a good fit? Here are the equity words we use, like disgusting. Nobody would put Coke with disgusting. Well, you might, but you can look at how some equity terms or how the category drivers then relate to that, right? And how you're biasing that to then talk about your messaging. So you can either take your survey data, you can do some conjoint, you can do some implicit association. But the whole point of leveraging the logic and reason is really forecasting the future, right? This is really what we're getting at, is looking at this concept of purchase intent, right? We really want to know, are you going to go out and buy? And can we predict that, right? This is no different than Doppler radar and the weathercasters. So the extent to which a consumer will categorically estimate whether or not they're going to buy now or sometime in the future, right? This is my paraphrased definition. And typically, like I showed you with the hotel survey, or one here, like you see in the bottom right-hand corner, one we used, we had people watch a series of ads and then said, based on those ads, how categorically likely are you to purchase, right? From brand A, B, or C. You can then convert those to numbers and then make a purchase intent. other thing that purchase intent is the gold standard by which all new technologies are compared. When I was doing some neuromarketing work, that was the first question that P&G asked us. Okay, great. You've got some brainwaves. How does this measure purchase intent? We have this facial recognition software. First question to come out of people's minds. How does this measure in market metrics like purchase intent? So purchase intent is the gold standard by which we measure how people are going to do. Right? It's predictive, like forecasting the weather. And hopefully you do better than the forecasters here. No offense to the meteorologists in Cincinnati. It's a difficult place to predict the weather because the river does funky things. Okay. Now, one last thing that you can do and take with all these and combine with all of these things is called segmentation. Right? And how many of you are Kurt Vonnegut fans? Again, I can't see anybody raising their hand, but all right. Yes, got some Vonnegut fans. Kurt Vonnegut in his classic novel, Cat's Cradle, talked about this concept of a grand falloon. And a grand falloon is specifically a group of people who identify in some sort of category that is just random and arbitrary. He uses the concept of a Hoosier as the example, right? I'm a Hoosier. Vonnegut was a Hoosier. But it just means we're from Indiana. Actually, a Hoosier is a piece of furniture from the 19th century. It means nothing, right? People from Ohio are called Buckeyes. It was a slanderous term based on the trees, right? We associate with things that have no meaning, right? And I use it as a joke, but segmentation is actually quite powerful because this is what we use to categorize based on variables of interest, right? And companies like L&E excel at being able to get you your segments for your particular study. If I'm interested in men's cologne and I'm interested in how men wear cologne, I'm not going to bring you, well, I got two subjects that I would bring in, right? I got two segments. For those you can't see, I got two men here. I would not ask any of you, right? If I'm looking at lipstick or makeup, I would not ask these two gentlemen. I would ask all of you, right? So segments serve a purpose, right? All based on what our needs are. And we can do this up front, what we call a priori, up front. We can look at, say, millennials versus Generation X or things like that. Hoosiers, women, loyalists, snackers. And what we do is we categorize them. We create the segment. We create a definition for who we include in that segment. And that's what we ask L&E that does so well to say, give us these segments so then I can interview them or do whatever I need to do with them, right? The reason why I call it a grand falloon is the psychologist in me, Abby would be called a millennial, and I would be called Generation X, but there's no way anybody would call her, if you knew her, you would call her a millennial, right? Just because we're 2 years apart doesn't make us in different categories, right? So how we categorize these things are different. I'm picking on you all day, but it's fun. So, here's the picture of segmentation, basically taking the population, pulling out specifically what you want. Now, another way you can do this is after the fact, right? So if a priori means up front, post hoc means afterwards. So what we can do is, here's an example of a survey I did for a boxing gym here in Cincinnati, the Punch House. We were doing this with Danny Calhoun, really just to play around with some data when he was just getting started. And we had people list categorically, here are a list of gym features. Name 1 through 5, what are your biggest priorities, right? And then we had everyone do it. We had a bunch of people do it. And then we used the data. We did a statistical analysis, what we call a k-means cluster. We did a cluster analysis to see if the data segmented in a way. So we didn't do this up front. We weren't looking at any segmentation profile. We were doing this afterwards. And what we found was there are a few different aspects of them, and you can see in green, for example, what we had was a cluster of people who were interested in how much it costs, what their personal connection was to the gym, whether or not they had access to it, and their training results, right? So this is more in the personal connection, right? So you can create a series of messaging. Hey, come to our gym where you're going to get the results you want at an open time where you're going to be known and you're going to get to be known at a price that you can afford, versus another segment where they were looking at the availability of class times, the gym location, and the actual circuit training itself. So, hey, we've got class times to fit your schedule and locations that fit your needs to get the circuit that you want, right? So you can create messaging profiles based on the data. And of course, you can combine these things. You can do segments. This is just demographic segments. You can look at what we call psychographic segments, like how people respond to what we call regulatory focus, or how people predict the future, or introverted versus extroverted. Any sort of psychological variable we like. We can do some psychographic things also. In the interest of time, I'll just briefly mention that there's this concept called regulatory focus that is really fantastic. And for those of you who've never heard of it, write it down, look it up. Tori Higgins at Columbia University. It's a great way to think about how people approach goals. Okay. So how do you leverage the thought process? Well, it's pretty simple. Numbers, data, right? One perfect example is J.C. Penney. How do you remember the debacle that J.C. Penney went through a few years ago, where their CEO said, hey, we're going to lower prices, and the price is what it is, and people aren't going to haggle, and they're going to see low prices, and it's going to win. And what happened? Kohl's destroyed them, because Kohl's said, hey, when you walk out of Kohl's, you get circled, hey, here's how much you saved, right? This is how much you won. You beat us. You got the great deal, right? So you win by numbers. 70% off, wow, that's a great deal. I feel good about that. 0% down. Or down here at the bottom, right? If you just show a picture, you say, wow, which one of these is more covered in the United States? The blue, the yellow, or the red? Wow, the red, that's all over the place, right? So again, go after the numbers. Go after the empirical data. Now, there's one thing to be weary of, and this was sent from Michelle L&E last week, and you don't have to read this, but we are getting overburdened with surveys and emails. Right? Even from some of my favorite sites, I'm unsubscribing because I'm tired of getting all this stuff clogging up my inbox. So too many surveys can be a bad thing, right? So it leads to what they've called deletist behavior. So Michelle, again, thank you for sending that. Okay, now in the interest of time, we're going to move away from feeling and thinking to where people are actually doing something, right? Right, so like Master Yoda said, or paraphrasing from the Tao Te Ching, from a Chinese philosophy, trying is intentional, right? I'm going to try to do something. Doing is the actual behavior, right? So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about people doing something, right? This workshop is fantastic. Maybe you learned something, maybe you found some cool stories, maybe you had something emotional happen, maybe you learned something fantastic. But if you do nothing with these data, if you do nothing with it, what purpose has it served, right? So the actions are what we're really looking for. Actions drive numbers. And what we're really talking about here is the consumer experience, right? And P&G speak in Praktish, we call these moments of truth. The first moment of truth, when you're at the shelf and you make that decision to put it in your cart. That second moment of truth where you actually use the product and then it either reinforces that match to then go back and have it again, or there's a mismatch where you're never going to use it again, right? The use of it, right, they call these moments of truth. And Google's added a 0 for advertising. So some of the ways we can do this, there's some really cool things that Disney are doing. I'll show you. I can't oogle over them enough. Is basically we're talking about watching people do something, right? Either here, right? We have them come in for a focus group and we watch from behind the mirror and we watch what they're doing, watch what they're saying, or watching how they're interacting. Or maybe we go to the grocery store and we follow behind them, right? Or some of the new technologies that we can do by setting up observational equipment, cameras in the home, and we watch them act naturally. So let me give you an example of things that, before I do that, let me say that the way people behave, right, is all in bell curves. Psychologists love curves, we love graphs, we love boxes. I love making fun of us. But this is the adoption curve, right? We've all heard this, that the innovators, and then the early majority. And so we need to think about how people are going to adapt or adopt to this, right? Apple comes out with a new iPhone 7, whatever that might be. You're going to get people who are waiting in line for days, right? The innovators or the early adopters. No, that's fine. Thank you for coming. I understand. I'm running late. That's fine. And then, like, for example, my father just got an iPhone 4, right, last year. So he's definitely a laggard, right? No offense, Dad. I'm not making fun of you. But there's no need for the iPhone that I do, right? Okay. So here, let me give you a fun example. So this is from the Restaurant of the Future. That's actually what it's called, the Restaurant of the Future. It's in Wageningen, Netherlands, where our company is based out of. This is a collaborative effort. And here's a picture of the actual environment with some of my colleagues. And here's an example taken from the study. And it's an open deli. It's an open cafeteria. And they just look at how people eat, take food, how they interact. So they had people come in, and they had 3 kinds of chicken sandwiches there for lunch. And it said that this was the new chicken sandwich, this was the cage hormone-free chicken sandwich, welfare-friendly, I think is how it translated, or the healthy chicken sandwich, right? And then they looked, and they found out that men were actually drawn to the new chicken sandwich, whereas women were drawn to the healthy chicken sandwich. Well, guess what? It was all the same chicken sandwich. Just how you called it, how you labeled it. Right? So the behavior is different based on what you're calling it. Right? There's some other fun things if you look on the Restaurant of the Future's website, principles of nudging. So before you go in, hey, would you like to try a free sample? Having that sample will then subsequently change your buying behavior. Right? Costco is huge on this. Hey, try a sample. Right? Not necessarily for the product you want. Sometimes it has category influences. But, right? So some of the things that we're trying to do now as researchers is what somebody called at the Quirk event, they called it anthropological ethnography, what we call unobtrusive ethnography. It's not traditional ethnography because we're not going to your house and we're not standing over you. We're going to your house, we're setting up recording equipment, and then we're asking you to act as naturally as possible. It takes a few days, but you'd be surprised. Like all these reality TV shows, people forget or they begin to act naturally. And then you can get their behavior, right? And you can start to see what is their consumer experience when you're not watching, right? Just like particle physics, the act of watching something changes its behavior. So if you can do it in an unobtrusive way, right? What you guys call ethnography, what we grew up calling observation, just observe people in their natural environment. So this is an example of a study we did in some emerging markets, looking at how people use the refrigerator. And so we recorded 7 days a week for 24 hours a day. How are people using the fridge in the home? Right? So now we can get a rich data set centered around morning, lunch, night, late night snacking. Instead of having somebody come in to a facility like this and use the fridge once, now we're looking at the interaction in the home. Right? And we can do all these things. Yes?
Would that be done for product categories rather than a specific brand?
It could be. So it could be done for specific categories or it could be done for a specific brand. Either. So you could do a segmentation of, let's say, I'm really interested. I'm trying to find something so I don't give away any specifics that we did. Like North Face, right? I'm a North Face loyalist personally. So we're interested in people who wear North Face, right? And how much do they have? Where do they keep it in their home? I'm making this up, but right. So you could look at category. They're looking at clothing. What the brand is. How are they using the brand? Right. So it's some interaction of those two, right? Without being specific to some of the things that we've done, trying to make this up on the spot, but. Right, so this is a really cool thing that you can do. You can set cameras up much like you were doing here, but now we're doing it in somebody's house. And we can look at how people are using products in the bathroom, how people are using products in the kitchen, right? All these kinds of things. Something else that's really emerging and blowing up, of course, we all have our wearables. We've all got our wearables. Well, Disney is taking advantage of this. And I can't oogle enough over this stuff because it's so brilliant, right? How many of you have actually been to Disney and actually seen the magic bands? What it is a wristband that does all of these things. So you can use it as your park entrance pass. Unlock your hotel room. All of your pictures get uploaded to it. It's your fast pass, right? And they're also doing it to integrate with some of the rides. So as you're sitting on the ride, it's reading your band. And so then Sebastian can say, oh, I'm going to say hi, Jason. Really customer focused. And to show you how interested they are, Disney has spent over $1 billion into this technology. Wearables are huge. You see them all over. I've got my Garmin on. You've got your Fitbit, I'm assuming, yeah, right? Wearables are huge, right? And I love this example. The behavioral neuroscientist in me loves being able to get data on how people are doing and what they're doing. Okay. Right. Good. Okay. I'm getting to, I got to talk faster and get on with it. Right. So, principles. Let people act naturally, right? Have them come in, just study what they do. We call this the observation bias, where just the fact of us being present changes their behavior. We want them to act naturally. And incorporate into their existing framework, right? Jewelry, right? I mean, we love wearables. I don't have my phone on me, but if we can do something with my phone, right? Don't introduce a new technology, innovate technologies we already have. Glasses, right? New Tobii tracking glasses. You can just put the glasses on. Now we can do eye tracking while we're mobile, right? Or in this case here, for example, from some of the stuff that we've done looking at the restaurant of the future, how they're walking around and where are the hot spots, things like that. Okay. So now in the interest of time, how do we put all these things together? Well, we've been talking about a lot of these things integrating as it is. But so, for example, when we conduct a survey and you ask somebody, hey, how did you feel about that? And you get a response, and then you ask them to tell you, hey, I noticed that you said you felt X about this. Tell me about that. Can they really tell you about that? Or are they just telling you what they think you want to hear? Are they truly aware of how they're feeling? And if they are so, are they going to be open and honest to tell you? Right? Some examples of the combinations of those. Car ads are a perfect example because car ads are all emotional. The first half of the car ad is, this is how sexy you're going to be if you drive our car, or this is how much fun it is to drive our car. And then once they've hooked you on the emotion, then they hit you with attractive lease offers or 0% down. Then they hit you with numbers, right? Then they hit you with logic. They don't start up front by saying, hey, get a good deal on this car. Oh, and by the way, you're going to like it. They're going to look how awesome this is. Oh, yeah, and by the way, here's some numbers to make you justify it and feel good about it, right? Or, for example, our emotions driving our actions, right? Some bad news while we're walking around the grocery store, ice cream in the cart, right? So our emotions driving our behavior, impulse buys. And some things we can do, of course, like free association, open-ended with the text analytics and these emerging technologies that we talked about. And then, of course, some fun examples being lifestyle brands, right? Lifestyle brands being brands that represent the way we live our life, right? Like I'm North Face. I have my North Face shoes. I have my North Face jeans. I have my shirt, my jacket. I could wear days on end of North Face gear, right? Because it represents all that I am. Even the concept of the North Face in the Northern Hemisphere not getting as much light and therefore being the more difficult path to travel. Even the concept of what the North Face means speaks to me personally, right? Lululemon is another perfect example. Apple, things like that, right? These brands have emotional connotation. Okay. So for the sake of time, I will say thank you very much. Thank you all for watching online. Please email questions to bizdev at leresearch.com. Bizdev at leresearch. Email your questions. We'll do everything we can to answer them. And if you guys have any questions here, thank you guys so much for your time. Thanks for coming. Enjoy your Friday. Thank you.